Earth had never been abandoned. It had simply been waiting. And now, for the first time in thousands of years, it was awake. The cold expanse of space swallowed the remnants of the HFY fleet, their battered warships retreating into the void, carrying with them the weight of their defeat. But for Commander Vorkash, there was no escape. He stood aboard his flagship, his claws resting on the command console, watching as the entity before him, a human, studied him with an eerie, unwavering stare. Everything had fallen apart. His forces, his fleet, his pride, obliterated in mere hours by an enemy that had barely broken a sweat. The HFY had come to Earth believing they were claiming the remains of a forgotten civilization, but instead they had awakened something far worse. Why? Vorkash finally asked, his voice hoarse. Why did you hide? Why let the galaxy believe you were gone? The human did not move, did not blink. When they spoke, their voice carried the weight of centuries. We were never gone. A chill ran through Vorkash's body. We watched, the human continued. We listened, we learned, and we waited. Vorkash gritted his teeth. For what? The human tilted their head slightly, as if the answer should have been obvious. For the galaxy to make a choice. Vorkash's eyes narrowed. And what choice was that? The human finally stepped closer, the air around them vibrating with a presence that felt beyond physical. Whether to leave us alone, or wake us up. A deep, terrible silence settled between them. You were warned, the human said again, the same phrase that had echoed across every battlefield. Vorkash felt a slow, creeping horror wrap around his thoughts. They had not simply been silent. They had been testing the galaxy, watching how it behaved, studying those who spread war, those who sought conquest, those who took without hesitation. And now that the HFY had crossed the line, humanity had responded. Vorkash exhaled sharply, straightening his posture. He would not let fear dictate his final moments. You've won, he admitted. Do what you will. But know this, my people will remember. They will come back. And next time, we will be ready. The human did not react, but something in the air shifted. A cold certainty settled over the command chamber. You misunderstand, the human said. For the first time, Vorkash hesitated. What? The human's eyes gleamed, their voice as calm as ever. There will not be a next time. The ship trembled. Vorkash's officers gasped as their consoles flickered and died. The warship's massive engines sputtered, then went silent. Every weapon, every system, everything ceased to function in an instant. And then the hull itself began to dissolve. Not in fire, not in an explosion. It was as if reality itself no longer recognized the existence of the ship. The walls, the floors, the very air around them unraveled into nothingness, vanishing without sound, without struggle. Vorkash felt the weight of inevitability press down on him. He had led his people into a war they had never been prepared for, and now he had doomed them all. He met the human's gaze one last time. You. There was no pain, no sensation, only silence. And then Vorkash was gone. Across the system, the final remnants of the HFY fleet fled toward the edges of known space, their desperate distress calls scattering into the void. But Earth did not pursue. The humans did not chase them down. They simply let them run. Because the warning had already been delivered. Across the stars, in every empire and every species that had once watched Earth from afar, the message spread like wildfire. The HFY had been defeated. Not in battle, not through attrition, but through sheer, absolute dominance. A single fact now echoed across the galaxy, reshaping the balance of power forever. Humanity was not extinct. Humanity was not weak. Humanity had simply been waiting. And now, the stars would never be the same again. The vast training facility of the Galactic Coalition buzzed with the murmurs of 100 different alien species. Towering reptilians with armored scales, feline warriors with razor-sharp claws, and psionic beings who could read minds without uttering a single word. All of them had gathered in the observation deck to witness the latest batch of recruits. Among them stood one anomaly, the lone human. Lieutenant David Carter adjusted his uniform, standing at attention as the training instructor. A massive four-armed Thalkar named Commander Vorsk paced in front of the recruits. His deep, gravelly voice carried authority, but it was laced with unmistakable amusement. Another human, Vorsk chuckled, shaking his head. They never learn. The aliens around him snickered. Everyone knew humans were physically inferior. No exoskeletons, no venomous fangs, no enhanced muscle density. They were fragile creatures, surviving by sheer luck and their obsession with technology. A bipedal species with nothing remarkable to offer. David remained silent as the laughter echoed around him. He had heard it all before. Weak, soft, unfit for real combat. He had been underestimated since the day he joined the coalition, and he knew better than to fight back with words. Instead, he watched. He studied the way the others moved, the way they stood. Some carried themselves like warriors, confident in their power. Others, like the telepathic Selkai, barely moved at all, secure in the knowledge that their minds were deadlier than any weapon. A towering, gorilla-like Ralvok warrior, almost twice David's size, sneered at him. "I don't understand why they even let humans train here," he growled. "What could you possibly contribute? The ability to break faster." More laughter. David's lips twitched, but he said nothing. Let them talk. He had no interest in proving himself to words. Commander Vorsk clapped his hands together, silencing the crowd. "Enough. We begin with a combat trial. You will fight in the training ring, one by one, to evaluate your abilities. No weapons, no technology, only skill and instinct." He paused, glancing at David with a smirk. "Let's see if the human can last more than a few seconds." David met his gaze without flinching. The observation deck erupted into noise as the first combatants were called. A reptilian fighter crushed his opponent's ribs with a single strike. A Selkai paralyzed his enemy's mind without even touching him. A feline warrior moved so fast that her opponent didn't even see the strike coming. The fights were brutal and efficient, each one reinforcing the same unspoken truth. Raw power ruled here. Then it was David's turn. His opponent stepped forward. A Kivarn, covered in thick plates of natural armor. The alien flexed its clawed fingers, smirking down at the human. "I will try not to break you too quickly," he said. David stepped into the ring, rolling his shoulders. He felt the weight of every gaze upon him. The expectation of failure. The quiet anticipation of humiliation. He could already hear the whispers, the bets being placed on how fast he would be knocked down. Vorsk raised his hand. "Begin." The Kivarn lunged. David didn't move. Not yet. The alien's attack was fast, faster than any normal human should have been able to react to. But David wasn't normal. He had spent years training, fighting, pushing his body to its limits. He had studied how every species fought, how they moved, where their weaknesses lay. At the last possible moment, he shifted. Just an inch. Just enough. The Kivarn's massive fist sailed past his head, missing him by a hair's breadth. And then, before the alien could recover, David struck. Not with brute force. He didn't have the size for that. But with precision. A strike to the joint where the Kivarn's armor was weakest. A twist, a step, a shift in balance. And suddenly, the towering alien was on the ground, gasping in shock. Silence fell over the arena. David stepped back, his expression unreadable. He didn't gloat. He didn't speak. He just waited. The other aliens stared, their amusement fading into something else, something more dangerous. Interest. Commander Vorsk narrowed his eyes. "Beginner's luck," he muttered. Then, louder. "Next opponent." The next fighter stepped forward. Faster, deadlier. The silence didn't last long. It never did. One moment of surprise was quickly swallowed by a wave of muttered disbelief, then louder jeers from the crowd of alien recruits. The Kievarn, still struggling to rise, clutched at his injured arm, his thick armor plates clicking together as he tried to mask the pain. His pride had taken more damage than his body, but the effect was the same. He had lost. To a human. David Carter didn't flinch under the weight of the stairs. He stood there, his posture calm, his face a blank mask, but his mind was sharp, calculating. He was outnumbered, outmatched, at least in the way the aliens measured strength. But that didn't matter. He wasn't here to overpower anyone. He was here to outlast them. Commander Vorsk's lip curled, a mixture of annoyance and curiosity flashing across his scared face. Next opponent, he growled, his forearms folding across his massive chest. Let's see if the human can survive 2 rounds. The crowd shifted, and a new figure emerged from the ranks of recruits. Xalarath. Lean, quick, and predatory. The alien moved with a fluid grace that spoke of speed and precision. His obsidian black skin shimmered under the overhead lights, and his piercing yellow eyes never blinked. The Xalarath species was known for their agility, faster than most species in the Coalition, with reaction times that made them seem like ghosts in battle. David watched the way the Xalarath's muscles coiled and uncoiled with every step, how his weight shifted almost imperceptibly, always ready to spring. This wasn't like fighting the Kievarn, who relied on brute strength. This would be a test of speed, reaction versus anticipation. The crowd murmured with anticipation. This time, they didn't bet on how fast David would lose. They bet on how hard the Xalarath would hit him. Vorsk raised a hand again. Begin. The Xalarath moved first. Of course he did. They always did. It was a blur of motion, too fast for most to follow. A streak of black slicing through the air. David barely saw the first strike coming, but he didn't need to see it. He felt the shift in the alien's balance, the twitch of muscle that preceded the attack. He sidestepped. The Xalarath's clawed hand slashed past his ribs, missing him by less than an inch. David didn't counter yet. He couldn't, not yet. He needed to learn more. Fighting wasn't just about trading blows. It was about understanding your opponent, reading them like a book written in blood and bone. The alien didn't stop. He twisted, his movements fluid like liquid shadow, launching a flurry of attacks, clawed hands swiping at David's throat, ribs, legs. Each attack was met with a dodge, a shift, a subtle retreat. The crowd's jeers grew louder. To them, it looked like David was running, dodging, evading, refusing to engage. Fight back, human, one of the Ralvok roared. Or is this your strategy? Running away. David ignored them. His breathing was steady, his heart rate controlled. He wasn't running. He was learning. The Xalarath grew more aggressive, frustrated by David's evasions. The strikes became less calculated, faster, but sloppier. And that's when David saw it. A pattern. Every time the Xalarath struck, his left leg bore the majority of his weight for a split second, an unconscious habit, a flaw hidden beneath his speed. And flaws were what David lived for. The next time the alien lunged, David didn't dodge. He moved into the attack. The crowd gasped. The Xalarath's hand sliced through the air, but David was already too close, too far inside the alien's reach for the blow to land. With a sudden twist, David hooked his arm around the alien's extended limb and shifted his weight. A perfectly executed throw. The Xalarath hit the ground hard, his breath exploding from his lungs. Before he could recover, David was already on him, his knee pressing into the alien's chest, his hand poised to strike. Though he didn't need to. The fight was over. Silence. Real silence, this time. No jeers, no laughter, just stunned, wide-eyed stares. David slowly stepped back, releasing the Xalarath, and allowing him to scramble to his feet. The alien didn't look at him with scorn, not anymore. There was something else in those yellow eyes now. Confusion. Maybe even a sliver of respect. Commander Vorsk's expression was unreadable. 2 rounds, he muttered. Interesting. David said nothing. He simply returned to his place in the line of recruits, his face calm, his mind already preparing for the next fight. The aliens might have laughed at him when this all started, but they weren't laughing anymore. The air in the training hall had shifted. The jeers and laughter that had greeted David Carter at the start of the combat trials had withered into something colder, an uneasy silence that clung to the walls like a shadow. No one spoke. No one mocked. Even the Ralvok, who had barked insults moments earlier, now studied David with a furrowed brow, his heavy arms crossed over his broad chest. David felt the change. It wasn't respect. Not yet, but it was the beginning of something else. A sliver of doubt. The kind that made predators pause before lunging, questioning if their prey might bite back. Commander Vorsk's 4 eyes remained fixed on David, his jaw tight. The Thulker had seen countless species fight in this ring, some with brute strength, others with blinding speed or psychic abilities. But humans, they weren't supposed to be a threat. They were supposed to be fragile, outmatched. This was unexpected. Again, Vorsk growled, his voice a low rumble that echoed through the chamber. From the crowd, another challenger stepped forward. A Ralvok named Goreth, massive, muscular, and moving with the confidence of someone who had never known defeat. His thick, dark fur rippled with every step, and his tusks gleamed under the harsh training lights. David didn't move. His mind was already working, already calculating. The Ralvok were different from the Kivarn and the Xalrath. They didn't rely on speed or precision. They were blunt instruments, hammers that crushed anything in their path. Power, that was their weapon. Overwhelming, relentless power. The crowd seemed to regain some of its earlier confidence. A Ralvok against a human. There was no contest. The size difference alone made it laughable. Goreth sneered, flexing his massive arms. He didn't fight like them. He fought like a human, using strategy, precision, and something none of these aliens seemed to understand. Control. Commander Vorsk's voice cut through the silence. Next, he growled. The crowd didn't cheer this time. They just watched. And David smiled, just a little. The silence in the training hall had evolved. It was no longer the quiet of disbelief. It was heavier, a thick fog of unspoken questions and cautious curiosity. David Carter could feel it pressing against him, an invisible weight more suffocating than the blows he had taken. The aliens weren't laughing anymore. They weren't sneering. They were staring, watching, calculating. He knew this feeling well. It wasn't respect. Not yet, but it was close. The first crack in the wall of contempt they had built around him. Commander Vorsk's expression was a mask of unreadable stone, but his 4 arms were tense, crossed over his chest in a way that suggested more than casual annoyance. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. The human wasn't supposed to win. Not once, not twice, and definitely not 3 times. Again, Vorsk said, his voice a low rumble that echoed through the chamber. Another opponent stepped forward. This time, it was a Drexian. Tall and sinewy. His purple skin rippled with bioluminescent veins, glowing faintly with each slow pulse of his heart. Drexians were hunters, apex predators from a world of eternal night. Their vision was sharper than most, and their reflexes were so fast that they could snatch an insect out of the air without blinking. They didn't rely on strength or speed alone. They relied on patience, precision, the exact kind of opponent David couldn't afford to underestimate. The crowd shifted uneasily. The Drexian didn't speak. He didn't sneer or threaten like the others. He simply stared at David, his eyes, black as a starless void, fixed on him like a predator locking onto prey. David recognized the difference immediately. This wasn't an opponent who fought with pride. The Drexian fought to win. Commander Vorsk raised his hand. Begin. David didn't move. Neither did the Drexian. For a long, tense moment, neither fighter made a sound. They simply circled one another, slow and steady, like two shadows testing the limits of their reach. The crowd was deathly quiet now. Even the Ralvok, who had roared with laughter earlier, said nothing. They sensed it too. This wasn't going to be a quick fight. The Drexian struck first. A blur of motion. So fast that David barely registered the attack until the alien's clawed hand was already slicing through the air toward his neck. He ducked, narrowly avoiding the strike. But the Drexian didn't stop. Another attack, faster this time, came at his ribs. David twisted, but the claws raked across his side. Pain flared, hot and sharp, but he didn't let it break his focus. He staggered back, his mind racing. The Drexian wasn't just fast. He was relentless, a storm of precision strikes and fluid movements. Each attack wasn't about overwhelming David. It was about breaking him piece by piece. A slash to the arm to weaken his guard. A strike to the leg to slow his movement. It was tactical, surgical. David couldn't outpace him, not with raw speed. So he didn't try. Instead, he waited. He let the Drexian keep attacking, dodging just enough to avoid a fatal blow, but never fully retreating. Each time the Drexian struck, David moved less. His dodges became tighter, smaller. He was getting closer. The Drexian noticed, his glowing veins pulsing a little faster now. His attacks grew more aggressive, each one meant to drive David back, to force him off balance. And then it happened. The Drexian overextended, a fraction of a second too eager to finish the fight. His right hand slashed for David's throat, but David didn't dodge. He stepped into the attack. His left hand caught the Drexian's wrist mid-swing, and his right fist drove hard into the alien's elbow joint, twisting it at an unnatural angle. A sickening pop echoed through the hall. The Drexian hissed in pain, his arm folding the wrong way. David didn't stop. He pivoted on his heel and drove his knee into the alien's ribs. Once, twice, until the Drexian staggered back, clutching his injured arm and struggling to breathe. Silence. Real silence. The kind that doesn't break easily. David didn't move, his chest rising and falling in steady rhythm. He felt the sting of the claw marks on his side, the dull throb in his shoulder from the earlier hit, but none of it showed on his face. The Drexian stared at him, not with anger, but with shock. Commander Vorsk's jaw tightened, his four eyes burning into David like twin suns. "Enough," he said, his voice low. David stepped back, releasing the Drexian's wrist and letting him stumble away. He returned to his place in the line of recruits, the blood from his side seeping into his uniform. But his posture never wavered. The crowd still didn't speak. Not until one of the Tselkai whispered, just loud enough for the others to hear. "He's adapting." David didn't react. But inside, a small flicker of satisfaction ignited. Because they were starting to see it now. He wasn't winning because he was stronger or faster, he wasn't. He was winning because humans didn't fight with raw power or reflex alone. They fought with their minds. And the aliens were finally starting to understand. The air in the training hall was different now. Heavier. Charged. Like a storm was gathering just beneath the surface of every alien watching. The silence wasn't just shock anymore. It was laced with something sharper. Suspicion. David Carter stood in the center of the ring once more, his breathing steady despite the sting of the Drexian's claw marks burning along his ribs. Blood had soaked into his uniform, a dark patch spreading beneath the tear in the fabric, but his expression didn't change. Calm. Focused. The aliens surrounding him weren't mocking him now. No one was laughing. No one was sneering. They were trying to understand. It wasn't supposed to be like this. A human wasn't supposed to win, not 4 times in a row. Not against opponents who were faster, stronger, and biologically superior in every measurable way. But David wasn't winning by playing their game. He was winning by playing his own. Commander Vorsk's 4 eyes remained locked on him, his jaw tense, the muscles twitching ever so slightly. Again, Vorsk said, his voice quieter this time, but somehow more dangerous. Another figure emerged from the ranks. This time, it was a Veldar. Tall and slender, with armor-like scales running down the length of his body, and 2 sets of arms, each tipped with curved black talons. Veldar were strategists, tacticians by nature. They didn't rely on brute strength or speed alone. They used technique, coordination, and worst of all, patience. David's mind sharpened. He had seen this before. The Veldar weren't like the Ralvok or the Drexian. They wouldn't charge in blindly or let their emotions steer the fight. No, this would be a war of attrition, a slow, precise dismantling. The Veldar studied him with unblinking, pupil-less eyes, the ridges along his neck flaring in subtle threat displays. "You've been lucky so far, human," the Veldar said, his voice a rasp like steel scraping against stone. "But luck doesn't last." David didn't answer. Commander Vorsk raised his hand. "Begin." The Veldar didn't move, not at first. He circled David slowly, his 2 lower arms staying close to his body, while the upper pair hovered in the air, talons flexing and unflexing. It was a test, a silent dare for David to make the first move. David didn't. He simply mirrored the Veldar's movements, matching his slow, calculated circling step for step. The crowd seemed unsure of how to react. It wasn't like the other fights. There was no immediate explosion of violence, no furious exchange of blows. This was quiet, tense. The Veldar struck first, quick, almost too quick to follow. His upper right hand lashed out in a feint aimed at David's face, while his lower left hand darted for David's ribs, clearly targeting the wound left by the Drexian's claws. But David didn't fall for the feint. He twisted his body just enough to avoid both strikes, stepping into the Veldar's range rather than backpedaling. Close quarters, uncomfortable for someone with longer reach. The Veldar's eyes widened, just a fraction. But David caught it. A crack in the calm. David struck, fast and brutal. His elbow drove into the Veldar's side, and before the alien could counter, David grabbed his upper wrist, twisting it at an angle that forced the Veldar's arm to bend unnaturally. A flash of pain crossed the alien's face, and David followed it with a knee straight to the Veldar's abdomen. The alien staggered, but didn't fall. He recovered quickly, slashing out with his lower talons. David dodged, but not fast enough. One claw caught his forearm, leaving a thin, burning gash. The crowd reacted, gasps, murmurs, but David barely registered it. He was too focused on the Veldar's movements. The pattern. The alien's lower arms were faster than the upper ones, quicker strikes meant to probe for weak points, while the upper limbs focused on grappling and defense. It was a coordinated system, almost like fighting 2 opponents at once. But systems had patterns, and patterns could be broken. David pressed the attack. He shifted his weight, deliberately leaving an opening on his injured side. Bait. The Veldar took it, his lower talon slashing toward the wound. But David was already moving. He caught the alien's wrist mid-swing and drove his heel into the Veldar's knee, twisting his arm at the same time. The joint gave way with a sharp crack. The Veldar hissed in pain, his balance broken, just for a second. David didn't hesitate. He slammed the alien down, pinning him with a knee against his chest, his hand hovering just above the Veldar's throat. No need to strike. The fight was over. Silence. The crowd didn't cheer. They didn't jeer. They just watched. The Veldar lay there, breathing hard, his forearms trembling, 2 clutching his dislocated knee, the others weakly pushing against the ground. Commander Vorsk's expression was unreadable. His jaw remained tight, his 4 eyes still locked onto David, but his silence spoke louder than any words could. David stood, slowly stepping back from the fallen Velder. Blood from the cut on his arm dripped onto the training room floor, joining the streaks of crimson already staining his uniform. The aliens didn't know what to say. For so long, they had believed humans were weak, soft creatures who relied on technology and diplomacy to survive. But David wasn't fast like the Xalarath. He wasn't strong like the Ralvok. And he wasn't a calculated predator like the Drexian. He was something else. He was adaptable. He didn't fight to win. He fought to learn, to outthink, to endure. And now, they were starting to realize the truth. Humans weren't dangerous because of their strength or speed. They were dangerous because they never stopped evolving. David wiped the blood from his arm with the back of his hand and locked eyes with Commander Vorsk. Again, Vorsk finally said, but this time, his voice wasn't mocking. It was cautious. And David, he allowed himself the faintest of smiles. The tension in the training hall had changed. Again, it wasn't the stunned silence of disbelief anymore, nor the cautious observation that had followed David's last few victories. Now, it was something sharper. He could feel it in the way the aliens stood, their postures a little too stiff, their gazes a little too focused. They weren't just watching him now. They were studying him. David Carter stood in the center of the ring, blood still drying on his uniform, his side aching from the Drexian's claws, and his arm stinging from the Velder's talons. He felt every bruise, every cut, but he kept his stance firm, his breathing steady. Pain was a companion now, familiar and constant. It wasn't a distraction. It was a reminder. Commander Vorsk's eyes, all four of them, hadn't left David since the last fight. His expression remained carved from stone, but there was a shift in his gaze. Not anger, not irritation. Something colder. Calculation. Again, Vorsk said, the word a blade slicing through the silence. Another opponent stepped forward. This time, it was a Korthan. David's muscles tensed. The Korthans were built for war. Massive, towering creatures covered in thick, plated skin, their limbs corded with muscle. Unlike the Velder's precision or the Drexian's speed, the Korthan was a wall of raw strength. They didn't fight to outthink. They fought to overpower. The Korthan's deep-set eyes narrowed as he sized David up, a low growl rumbling from his chest. I'm not like the others. Human, he said, his voice a gravelly snarl. I won't dance around you. I'll break you. David didn't respond. Words didn't matter here. Commander Vorsk's hand rose and fell. Begin. The Korthan moved fast, far faster than something his size should have. A blur of muscle and momentum, charging straight at David like a battering ram. David dodged, but just barely. The Korthan's massive fist swung past him, the force of the missed punch sending a sharp gust of air against David's face. He didn't get time to breathe. The Korthan pivoted with surprising speed, using his momentum to swing again. This time, David wasn't fast enough. The punch connected, not a direct hit, but a glancing blow to David's shoulder, and it felt like being hit by a sledgehammer. Pain flared instantly, radiating down his arm and into his ribs. David staggered back, his vision swimming for a second, but he didn't go down. The Korthan grinned. Not so fast now, are you? David ignored him. Pain could be pushed aside, but only if his mind stayed sharp. He couldn't match the Korthan in strength, and he couldn't keep dodging forever. So he adapted. He changed the rhythm. Instead of retreating, David moved forward. The Korthan blinked, clearly expecting him to back away, not step into his range. David ducked under the next swing and drove his fist into the Korthan's side. The ribs. It was like punching solid stone, but David didn't stop. He didn't aim for a knockout blow. He aimed for soft points, the small seams between the Korthan's plated skin, the armpit, the joint of the knee, the thin skin beneath the jaw. Strike after strike. Quick, sharp, relentless. The Korthan roared, swiping at David again. This time, David didn't dodge completely. He twisted just enough for the punch to graze his side. It hurt, but it let him step closer, too close for the Korthan to use his full strength. David drove an elbow into the Korthan's throat, not hard enough to crush it, but enough to make the alien gag. Then came the knee to the stomach. Again, not a knockout move, but a destabilizing one. The Korthan's balance shifted, just a fraction, but it was all David needed. With a sharp twist, David hooked his foot behind the Korthan's knee and shoved. The alien didn't fall hard, but he fell. And in the stunned silence that followed, it was clear what had just happened. David had taken down an opponent twice his size, not with brute force, but with precision, with control. The Korthan stared up at him, stunned, his massive hands gripping the floor as if trying to understand how he had ended up there. David didn't move, didn't gloat, just took a step back and waited for Commander Vorsk's next order. Silence again, but this time it felt dangerous. Commander Vorsk's jaw tightened. Enough. The Korthan rose slowly, his gaze burning into David, but there was something else behind the anger. Confusion. David didn't care. Because now, the aliens weren't just seeing him as an anomaly. They were seeing him as a threat. And that meant the rules of the game were about to change. The training hall was deathly silent now. Not the stunned, disbelieving silence of the first fight. Not the calculating quiet that followed David's later victories. This was something else. A silence that crackled with tension, with the realization that whatever they thought they knew about the human standing before them was wrong. David Carter stood in the center of the ring, his body a canvas of bruises, cuts, and bloodstains. His ribs throbbed from the Drexian's claws, his arm still burned from the Veldar's talons, and his shoulder ached where the Korthan's fist had grazed him like a hammer blow. He felt every injury, but he remained steady, his breathing controlled, his stance unyielding. He wasn't just fighting to win anymore. He was fighting to prove something. Commander Vorsk's gaze had hardened into something colder, his forearms crossed tightly over his broad chest. This wasn't entertainment for him anymore. This wasn't a lesson in humiliating the weak human. This had become something far more serious. David could see it in the way the aliens stood, no longer smirking or mocking. Now they were stiff, their eyes fixed on him with something just shy of fear. The human wasn't supposed to be this dangerous. Vorsk finally broke the silence. Again. But this time, his voice wasn't commanding. It was tight, reluctant. Another alien stepped forward. Exalvar. David's stomach nodded. He knew this species. They were assassins by nature, born from a high-gravity world that bred speed and agility into their very bones. The Talvar was smaller than the Korthan, lean and wiry, with pale, almost translucent skin that shimmered faintly under the harsh lights of the training hall. Long, clawed fingers twitched at his sides, and his glowing, pupil-less eyes never blinked as they locked onto David. Unlike the others, the Salvar didn't speak. He didn't growl or taunt. He simply waited, body coiled like a spring, his movements so subtle they were almost imperceptible. David's jaw tightened. This was different. The Xalvar wasn't here to test him. He was here to end this. Commander Vorsk raised his hand. Begin. The Xalvar moved, and he was fast. Faster than any of David's previous opponents. A blur of motion, so quick that David barely registered the attack until the Xalvar was already behind him, claws slicing through the air toward his back. David twisted at the last second, the alien's claws grazing his side. Another cut. But he didn't stop moving. He couldn't. The Xalvar wasn't giving him a moment to breathe. Every move was a blur of speed and precision. Slashes aimed at vital points. Quick jabs targeting joints and tendons. Each attack wasn't meant to overpower. It was meant to cripple. To dismantle David piece by piece. David didn't try to match the Xalvar's speed. He couldn't. Instead, he adapted. He shifted his stance, kept his movements tight and controlled. not dodging the way that Xalvar expected, but deflecting. Instead of trying to avoid every strike, he redirected them, guiding the alien slashes away from vital points, taking minor cuts instead of devastating blows. The crowd was deathly silent, watching, waiting, as the two fighters became a blur of motion. But David wasn't just defending, he was learning. The Xalvar's pattern emerged, a slight hesitation before every strike to his left, a fractional pause after each downward slash. Small openings, but openings nonetheless, and David seized them. The next time that Xalvar struck, David didn't dodge. He stepped into the attack. The alien's claws raked across David's arm. But before the Xalvar could retreat, David grabbed his wrist and twisted. A sharp crack. The Xalvar hissed in pain as David drove his knee into the alien's ribs. Once, twice. Before slamming an elbow into the Xalvar's jaw, the alien staggered back, disoriented. David didn't stop. He lunged, driving a punch into the Xalvar's stomach, then spun behind him and hooked his arm around the alien's neck, pulling him into a chokehold. The Xalvar thrashed, clawing at David's arm, but his broken wrist weakened him, and the human's grip only tightened. The alien's struggles grew slower, weaker, until finally his body went limp. David released him, letting the Xalvar collapse to the ground. Unconscious. Silence. The aliens didn't move. Commander Vorsk didn't speak. David stood there, his chest heaving, blood dripping from his wounds onto the training hall floor. He was battered, bruised, but still standing. And in that moment, in the heavy silence that followed, the truth finally settled over the crowd like a dark cloud. David wasn't the strongest. He wasn't the fastest. But he was something far more dangerous. He was relentless. He was adaptable. And most importantly, he didn't stop learning. Commander Vorsk's jaw clenched, his four eyes burning into David like twin suns. But his voice, when he finally spoke, was quiet. Enough, he said. And David, he didn't smile this time. He just stared back at Vorsk and waited. Because he knew this wasn't over.